By the time Holzenbeck gave his Danzig lecture, it was no lecture. None of the events described ever happened, but the words in Roman type are from his 1920 pamphlet on Avant Dada. Thanks to the holes punched in his eyes in the Cabaret Voltaire, he had seen it all. Far more than he ever wanted to see. As time went on, he saw it again and again. Quote, the Dadaist is a man of reality who loves wine, women, and advertising. End of quote, he said in 1920. Soon enough, advertising would be Dada. Dada would be everywhere he looked, dogging his footsteps, and so, like the rest, he would run from it. The great goal of dissolving all boundaries between art and life would be realized, which meant there was nothing left to do but contemplate the strange way in which the realization of the great goal had not granted everyday life the transformative power of art, but only dissolved art's power and produced nothing to replace it. Contemplate that. Or talk about the legend. For a fee. Those days in Zurich. I was there. Or remember that before there was Dada, there was an ad for Dada shampoo. I'm going to read that last couple of sentences again. The great goal of dissolving all boundaries between art and life would be realized, which meant there was nothing left to do but contemplate the strange way in which the realization of the great goal had not granted everyday life the transformative power of art, but only dissolved art's power and produced nothing to replace it. Contemplate that. Or talk about the legend for a fee. Those days in Zurich, I was there. Or remember that before there was Dada, there was an ad for Dada shampoo. It's a really fucking sloppy ass couple of sentences. I'm going to read it again and try to make sense of it and talk about the sentence that I have trouble with. The great goal of dissolving all boundaries between art and life would be realized, comma, which meant there was nothing left to do but contemplate the strange way in which the realization of the great goal had not granted everyday life the transformative power of art, comma, but only dissolved art's power and produced nothing to replace it, comma. Contemplate that, comma, or talk about the legend, comma, for a fee, comma, those days in Zurich, comma, I was there. Or remember that before there was Dada, there was an ad for Dada shampoo. Doesn't make any fucking sense. There's a mistake in there somewhere. In 1980, Bob Ackerman advertised a vacation package at a New Belsen theme park, and a wire service picked up the story. By then, the word Dada was in the dictionaries. Artists from all countries claimed it. There were quarterlies and conferences, archives and revivals, but if Dada lived, it was in such novelty items buried in the daily papers, weird tales that blew up the frank exchange of views prose of front-page propaganda or never touched it. Bob Ackerman, not Andy Warhol, was the real neo-Dadaist. Even if on this level too, Dada was a replica of itself. Old news. After all, it was only 1921 when the Basel News offered its readers a package tour to the battlefields of Verdun, promising, quote, the quintessence of the horrors of modern warfare, end of quote. Real life as modern art, quote, unforgettable impressions, end of quote, of destroyed villages, quote, enormous cemeteries containing hundreds of thousands of fallen men, end of quote. And everybody was doing it. First come, first served. Not only to the French mind is Verdun the battlefield par excellence on which the enormous struggle between France and Germany was finally decided. If the entire war cost France 1,400,000 dead, almost one-third of that number fell in the sector of Verdun, which comprises but a few square kilometers. The Germans suffered more than twice the number of casualties there. In this small area where more than 1 million men, perhaps 1.5 million, bled to death, there is not a square centimeter of soil that was not exploded by grenades. Afterwards, the travelers should cover the battlefields of the Argonne Forest, the River Somme, wander through the ruins of Reims, returning via Saint-Mihiel and the Priest Forest, but everything merely repeats. Umba, umba. Details which at Verdun combine into an unprecedentedly phenomenal panorama of horror and dread, wine and coffee and gratuities included. The great Vienna critic Karl Kraus was appalled. I am holding in my hand a document which transcends and seals all the shame of this age and would in itself suffice to assign the currency stew that calls itself mankind a place of honor in a cosmic carrion pit, he wrote. After the monstrous collapse of the fiction of culture, the age has nothing left but the naked truth of its condition. so that it has almost reached to the point where it is no longer capable of living, no longer capable of lying, end of quote. Krauss's first sentence was Holzenbeck's kind of language. His second, Ball's. But Krauss was not a Dadaist. He was simply saying what he meant. 56 years after he wrote, the Sex Pistols would offer him an answer record. Quote, Holidays in the Sun, end of quote. Bomb sites, Hitler's bunker, the Berlin Wall, wine and coffee and gratuities not included. And by what means was it that a line from the Basel News to Karl Kraus to excursion rates for Auschwitz cattle cars to the Sex Pistols to Bob Ackerman pierced itself together? This is the history the Dadaists were fighting and the history they were acting out, all of it appearing on the stage at the same time, to reduce the age and its language to the point where it was no longer capable of lying, even if that meant it would no longer be capable of speaking, had been precisely their goal. Had they been there at the end of the line, they would have been in ecstasy, convulsed by the thrill of having been proved right. Then they would have thrown up, but Dada would still be laughing. To be a Dadaist was to be a man of reality who loved wine, women, and advertising. To have a smile on your lips, a song in your heart, and a skull in your pocket. By January 1917, Holzenbeck was in Berlin, a Dada courier. There he would join with new comrades who were almost as mean as he was. Raoul Hausmann, Walter Mehring, Franz Young, George Gross, Johannes Bader, Hannah Hoch, John Hartfield, Wieland Hirschfeld. After the health resort of Zurich, Holzenbeck exulted. Berlin was real life. Fear was in everybody's bones. All authority was collapsing, which meant that anything was possible, that anyone could be shot down in any street. Destruction beckoned. In 1917, the Germans were beginning to give a great deal of thought to their souls. Holzenbeck wrote of the last days of the war, quote, This was only a natural defense on the part of a society that had been harassed, milked dry, and driven to the breaking point. A phenomenon familiar in German history was against manifested, Germany will always become a land of poets and thinkers when it begins to understand that it has mismanaged itself as a land of judges and hangmen. Thus came the Ampholyskepsists, Himmelists, the expressionists who pulled people gently by the sleeve and led them into the half-light of the Gothic cathedrals, where the street noises died down to a distant murmur and, in accord with the old principle that all cats are gray in the dark, men without exception are fine fellows. Expressionism performed the magic trick of taking Germany inward and heavenward at the same time, so the new Berlin Dada Club countered with magic of its own, the word. That was all they had, Dada, 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. Meeny tekel a parson, dropped down into a two-step Dada trot, they named the dance, thoughtfully publishing photos demonstrating exactly how to do it. They trumpeted the word as the great mystery, secreting it in the corners of paintings where people turned into monsters and machines. They left it dripping on walls, launching the word like a rocket out of their cut-ups and collages, printing it up on handbills, wearing it on sandwich boards and on their clothes, shouting it in the streets or on the stage. They claimed it as the most obvious fact. The word became the modifier. No other word capable of meaning without Dada attached to it. No other word able to hold its meaning with Dada riding on its back. Crowds came to hear it happen, to watch the void be conjured up. Now, Holzenbeck said, they were suddenly confronted with people who deliberately severed the process of communication, the causal nexus between payment and wear, between expectation and fulfillment, end of quote. Hausmann broke the sound poems Holzenbeck brought from Zurich into letter poems. The dictatorship of the phoneme was overthrown. Even names split and reformed. Grossfield, Harthaus, Georgeman. The Dadaists ruled an invisible empire, so they took titles. Marshal Dada, Gross, who cultivated his resemblance to a Prussian junker. Monteur Dada, Hartfield, the photomontagist. Progress Dada, Hirschfeld, a communist. Dadasov, Hausmann, the philosopher, the word perhaps taken to mask his Neanderthal brow. Oberdada, Bader, who thought he ruled the world. Meister Dada, Holzenbeck. Dada became a game, powered by a loathing so strong at times it was all but undifferentiated. Dada became fun. Throwing off all vestiges of aesthetics, philosophy, ethics, Dada became what perhaps it had always wanted to be. Merely a voice, a sound. The voice battered itself against the walls of honor and decency, looking for limits, finding none. When Holzenbeck, speaking the Dada language of backward and forward so fast not even he knew what he was saying, announced that, quote, "We were for the war and Dadaism today is still for war. Life must hurt," end of quote. There were mutilated veterans in the audience. But on the stage behind him, there were no aesthetes like Arp, no careerists like Zara, no Catholics like Ball to stop the show to ask what it all meant. The momentum was all towards spleen. The most arresting images the group left behind are mouths, Hausmann's or Hartfield's, open, teeth bared, words or letters spewing forth like giant microbes. "We will drown you out." Like the extraterrestrial slime in The Creeping Unknown, the 1954 film that preceded 5 Million Years to Earth in the Quatermass series, Dada in Berlin began as a speck and expanded until it swallowed the city. So it went in the Invisible Empire. When in 1918 the time came for Holzenbeck and Hausmann to ask, quote, "What is Dadaism and what does it want in Germany?" end of quote, the answer was self-evident. Dadaism demands the introduction of progressive unemployment through comprehensive mechanization of every field of activity. Only by unemployment does it become possible for the individual to achieve certainty as to the truth of life and finally become accustomed to experience. The Central Council demands compulsory adherence of all clergymen and teachers to the Dadaist Articles of Faith, the immediate erection of a state art center, elimination of concepts of property in the new art, expressionism. The concept of property is entirely excluded from the super-individual movement of Dadaism, which liberates all mankind. Introduction of the simultaneous poem as a communist state prayer. Establishment of a Dadaist advisory council for the remodeling of life in every city of over 50,000 inhabitants. Immediate organization of a large-scale Dadaist propaganda campaign with 150 circuses for the enlightenment of the proletariat. Submission of all laws and decrees to the Dadaist Central Council for approval. Immediate regulation of all sexual relations according to the views of international Dadaism through establishment of a Dadaist sexual center. It sounds familiar because 2 decades later, all Germany would be living it out. Hausmann always thought it was a joke. He said after the Nazis had come and gone, he was never sure about Holzenbeck, quote, "the significance of this program," end of quote. Holzenbeck wrote in 1920, was Dada as, quote, "no more than an expression of the times, taking into itself all their knowledge, their breathless tempo, their skepticism, but also their weariness, their despair of a meaning or a truth," end of quote. But that wasn't it at all, he said as an old man speaking to his friend Hans J. Kleinschmidt. He had wanted to change society, quote, "There was a moment in Berlin when I would have accepted the help of the devil to accomplish it," end of quote. He remembered, but the devil was otherwise occupied. All Holzenbeck left behind was a legend which he carried with him the rest of his life. "No, no, no," he said in one of his milder Berlin moments. "The highest art will be that which in its conscious content presents the thousand-fold problems of the day, the art which has been visibly shattered by the explosions of last week, which is forever trying to collect its limbs after yesterday's crash," end of quote. Dada was to be the art and also the explosion, and then another called up by the art of yesterday's crash. There was to be no end to Dada. Still, all this was hard to get across. In January 1917, Holzenbeck crossed the border from Switzerland into Germany far more easily than his neighbor Lenin would 4 months later. For Holzenbeck, no sealed train was required. The police weren't stupid. For Holzenbeck, there would be no Finland station. He too returned to revolution, but not to power. The invisible empire aside, he returned first to pedantry. When he first spoke publicly in Germany on Dada in a lecture hall for a fee, He simply recounted the discovery of the Philosopher's Stone. It was, he said then of the Cabaret Voltaire, a Hexen Sabbath, a sorcery. I was the cantor, an almost mythic figure, he said, with plenty of schmaltz. You know, Ball's aesthetic production in the face of what, in those days, passed for total war. A nightclub versus a theme park. The history of the 20th century was to be the account of the creation of reality through its erasure, through killing people, through the extermination of subjective objects, of realized or potential individuals as forests to be cleared. The triumph of this work can be found in the fact that we have neither art nor language to translate it. That when we try to think about those who were exterminated in Europe in the 1910s and 40s, Hitler, 1939, quote, who today remembers the Hitler, 1939, quote, who today remembers the Armenians, end of quote. Or in the USSR in the 1920s and 30s, in China in the 50s, Indonesia in the 60s, Cambodia in the 70s, out of the ashes, the new man. We can't think of those people as such. We can see Alban Barkley, but we can't see what Barkley saw. When Ball wrote of the need to erase everything that had been written, when Zara said he didn't care if anyone existed before him, when Hulsenbeck chanted the end of the world, the Dadaists fed on this impulse, even as their disgust over its wastes brought them to life. Dada, like the century, was the right to piss and shit in different colors, white, yellow, black, and red. Repeatedly in the first years of the Nazi regime, the Gestapo came looking for Hulsenbeck. Is this the residence of Hulsenbeck the Dadaist? No, his wife would answer. This is the residence of Hulsenbeck the doctor. Safe in the United States, he would never tire of citing the 1936 Nuremberg speech in which Hitler condemned Dada as a slime pit, as proof of Dada's innocent power. But it is not difficult to conclude that Hitler, once part of a bohemian milieu, always a painter and artist, railed so long and hard against Dada because it had touched him, because he felt its pull, just as Ball felt the nihilism in Marinetti's Parole and Libertà. Surlai, the whiff of death in Henning's Glore. Hulsenbeck, the thrill of total rule in what is Dadaism and what does it want in Germany. Certainly Carl Jung, speaking in London in the same year Hitler spoke in Nuremberg, would not have found it difficult. He knew the pull went in two directions. A purely personalistic psychology, by reducing everything to personal causes, tries its level best to deny the existence of archetypal motifs, and even seeks to destroy them by personal analysis. I consider this a rather dangerous procedure, which cannot be justified medically. Can we not see how a whole nation is reviving an archaic symbol, yes, even archaic religious forms, and how this mass emotion is influencing and revolutionizing the life of the individual in a catastrophic manner? The man of the past is alive in us today to a degree undreamt of before the war of 1914 to 1918. And in the last analysis, what is the fate of great nations but a summation of the psychic changes in individuals? That had been Ball's argument, which could have been Hitler's. Quote, I could not live without the conviction that my own personal fate is an abbreviated version of the fate of the whole nation, end of quote. It is no matter that, in all his megalomania, Ball would have been horrified by Nazism, which, as a fact of history, Jung went on to weave into a version of the thesis Norman Cohn would set forth in 1957 in The Pursuit of the Millennium. Cohn was greeted with incredulity when he argued that the exterminating impulses of the 20th century could be traced to unsatisfied debts first levied by the heretics and inquisitors of the Middle Ages. To Jung, it was obvious. There is no lunacy people under the domination of an archetype will not fall prey to. If 30 years ago anyone had dared to predict that our psychological development was tending towards a revival of the medieval persecutions of the Jews, that Europe would again tremble before Roman fasces and the tramps of legions, that people would once more give the Roman salute as 2,000 years before, and that instead of the Christian cross and archaic swastika would lure onward millions ready for death, why that man would have been hooted at as a mystical fool. So Jung explained, there are as many archetypes as there are typical situations in life. Endless repetition has engraved these experiences into our psychic constitution, not in the form of images filled with content, but at first only as forms without context. Forms without content, representing merely the possibility of a certain type of perception and action. When a situation occurs which corresponds to a given archetype, that archetype becomes activated and a compulsiveness appears, which, like an instinctual drive, gains its way against all reason and will. This was Jung's account of Nazism. In it was the power principle Debord would grasp. The reversible connecting factor. The idea that the empty repetitions of modern life, of work and spectacle, could be detorned into the creation of situations, into abstract forms that could be infused with unlimited content. But the situationist idea was at bottom a Dada idea. And Jung's account of Nazism needs only an excision of its specific examples to serve as an account of what the Dadaists sought in the Cabaret Voltaire. Dada was a protest against its time. It was also the bird on the rhinoceros, peeping and chirping, but along for the ride. Dada was a prophecy, but it had no idea what it was prophesying, and its strength was that it didn't care. Dada was a traffic accident. It was a cult. Dada was a mask, eyes without a face. Dada was a religion, spawn of ancient heresies. Dada was a war, but over souls, not bodies. So are all wars.